Holly with Stella Mari's Quilts. Welcome to our series on 50 blocks for 50 states, following along with the designs from this book. Go ahead and check out the description box below for more information about that, as well as the link to the pattern that we've written with step-by-step instructions. The block for today is North Carolina, and this block is going to use a lot of Y seams. I will go through that, how to do that within the videos. However, I do also have a video on doing Y seams, so you might want to check that out as well for just some more information. So go ahead and grab your cup of tea and let's get started. For the North Carolina block, we're going to need 2 4-inch squares of our medium. We're going to need 8 4x5-inch rectangles of our medium. We're going to need 1 2 3/4-inch square, 2 2 1/4-inch squares. We're going to need 4 dark triangles of a smaller size. The finished size should be 3.5 once everything's pieced together. We're going to need 4 dark triangles that will finish at 4 inches. We're going to need 8 of the light, and then we're going to need 4 2 by 3 3/4 rectangles of our light. To cut the triangles, these can be done as 30 degree triangles if you have a 30-degree ruler. If you don't have a 30-degree ruler, I have included templates for that in the pattern, which is in the description box below. To cut them, you'll basically just take your strip of fabric at 5 inches. You'll lay your template on, and then you'll just cut along the side and the side. If there's any extra up at the top, you can just trim it off. And you'll cut 4 of the larger one. And then you can just nest the smaller one right into the same angle because they are the same degree. And cut 4 of your shorter ones. And then just trim off whatever excess you have from the top or bottom, however you decide to orient that. If you choose to use a 30-degree triangle to make these template to make these triangles, the points may not line up perfectly within the block, but it's up to you of whether or not that's going to bother you. It kind of bothered me a little bit, so that's why I created these templates so that they'd fit together nicely. So let's go ahead and just get started with working on this block. We're going to start by creating a center unit that we will then add the triangle legs to later. To do that, we're going to need our center square, which is 2 3/4 inches. We're going to need our 2 1/4-inch squares. From these, we are going to cut them in half diagonally, just the one time, so we end up with 4 triangles. Make sure I have those stacked and lined up nicely. And these are going to line up just like this. And then we're going to put our light rectangles, making sure we have the right sides. It's kind of hard to tell which way is right side and wrong side on this fabric. I'm just going to line those up right in here, just like that. When we sew this together, we want to make sure that we prepare it to be able to use Y seams later. So what we're going to do is on the backs of our lights, I'm going to flip them over, and on the side, the edge that meets right out here, so this one, this one, this one, this one, here, 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 and here, I'm going to mark where my 1/4-inch seam is going to finish. To do that, I'm just going to use my ruler here, line it up so I know where my 1/4 inch is, and I'm just going to use a marking tool and draw a line, and then from the other edge, I'm going to just draw my intersection point. This will become my start and stop point for where we need to do Y seams. And I'll do that on all 4 of these. Then when I go to sew these together, I will flip the center will just get sewn together nice and easy all the way down the sides. The top and the bottom here, when I do it, I'll flip these just so I can show you. I'll flip this over, and as I sew, I am going to start at that 1/4 inch intersection point and sew down to the end. When I start, I'll do a little bit of a back stitch just to secure it and sew to the end. And then same thing when I sew the other side on here, I'll sew, feeding it through my machine probably this way, I'll start here and sew and then stop at that intersection point. This will prepare it for the Y seams that are going to come down the road. So I'm going to go ahead and get this assembled and show you what that looks like. And here's what that center section now looks like with it all sewn together. You'll see that I've left the stitching open a 1/4 inch away from the edge because we're going to be attaching triangle units at all of these points, and we're going to need those Y seams. So I'm going to put that aside for now, and we'll move on to the next step. We're going to work on our triangle units. We have 2 triangle units that we're going to do. One is for the corners and one is for the sides. For the corners, what we're going to do is we're going to take 1 dark and 2 lights, and we're going to sew them together just like that. To do that, we'll just flip over on the side here. We're going to make sure that when we sew, we've got about right where that intersection is. That's our 1/4 inch seam. We have about a 1/4 inch right at that intersection at the bottom. And we're just going to sew that down, and then we'll press it back and we'll add the second one doing the same thing. For our other corner triangle unit, we are going to use our smaller dark triangles, and we're going to add one of our 4x5 inch rectangles to either side. It's going to look really funny, but we're going to trim it to the right measurements when we're done. So we'll just take our triangle, we'll put it on here pretty much centered-ish. I like to just kind of make sure my top is pretty close to the top edge here, and then just sew down your 1/4 inch. Press that back and then add the other side and sew down. I kind of like to sew from the side with the dark just so I can see where the dark is lining up to that edge. So we'll go ahead and assemble both of those and then move on to some trimming. Now that we have both of those units prepared, we're going to do some trimming. First, I'm going to trim my units that will end up being in the corners. What we're doing here is we're going to make sure that we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance off the point. So I'm going to line up my ruler so that I have my 1/4 inch mark lined up with that point, and I'm going to make sure my ruler is straight with the base of that triangle by lining up some lines nice and straight there, and then a line is going down right the center of that triangle. I want to make sure it's nice and straight. There shouldn't be a lot to trim off the end here, but we're just going to trim it and make it nice and straight. Then we're going to flip this around, and we're going to measure 4.5 inches from the edge that we just trimmed. 1, 2, 3, 4.5. And we're going to go ahead and just trim off a little bit on the base there. I felt like I had more comfort if I had a little bit of wiggle room to trim it up when I was done versus trying to make them perfect on that first pass. So I'll do that to all 4 of these units. And for the second one, we're going to do similar. It's a little bit of an odder shape, of course. So what we're going to do is we're going to, again, try and get make sure we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance off the point by lining up 1/4 inch marking there. And I'm again making sure I've got a nice straight line with the base, and then I'm nice and centered here so that I can trim this. And then I'm going to cut a parallel line. This one we're going to trim at 4 inches. So I'm going to make my line nice and straight here. I'm also looking at my center line down the center from that point is nice and straight. And then I'm just going to trim off that little bit of excess down at the bottom. Then we're going to use our 60-degree ruler. And we're going to line it up, but we're not going to do a full 60 degrees. We're actually going to push our ruler up so that the measurement is for a finished size of 5¼ inches. So my ruler has down one side along the center. This would be the finished size of my 60-degree triangle. And then on this side, it tells me what that strip width would be. So depending on what your 60-degree ruler has on it, I'm going to make sure that my center line is nice and centered with that point. My measurement is nice and straight at the bottom here. And I'm looking for a finished height of 5¼ inches. And I'm just going to go ahead and trim both sides. And I did that one wrong. I'll have to redo that. You want the point at your base. So let's trim up another one since I did that one the wrong direction. Okay, we are going to make sure we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the point. I'm going to make sure that my ruler is nice and straight by making sure my base of the triangle lines up nice and straight with some points on my ruler. I'm going to trim, flip this around. I'm going to trim it at 4 inches. And I like to make sure that the center line of my triangle here goes right down the center, and then trim off the base. With the point down, we're going to then trim with the finished size being 5¼ inches, center line going right down the center. You can see it going through the point, and then and that's what that unit should look like after it's been trimmed. So I'll go ahead and make a new one to fix the one that I did by the wrong way, and I'll trim up the rest of these pieces. Now it's time to start laying things out. So we're going to take our sides and we're going to put them here so that it forms more of like an elongated cone shape. And then we're going to take our other units and they're going to go in the corners. And now we get to do a whole bunch of Y seams. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to sew all of these units to the center first, and then I'll come back and sew my side units to the center, and then I'll do all of my connecting seams here. All of these points all the way around are going to be Y seams. So I'm going to take my piece here. I'm going to use my ruler and I'm going to line up my 1/4 inch mark in a spot that I can actually see. And I'm going to mark the back just across where my seam is. And that intersection is going to tell me where that 1/4 inch mark is. And that point then should line up with the points I've already drawn. And I can use a pin to just stick the pin through here, stick it through here where that intersection point is, and just make sure that lines up, and do the same thing on this side. Put the pin in all the way through. And then just take that to my sewing machine and go ahead and sew from that point to this point, back stitching at both ends and leaving it open to be able to do more connecting. So I'll do that for all 4 of my dark and lights, and then I'll add all of my other pieces. Here's what the assembly looks like so far. I actually went ahead and pressed this seam open, hoping that it'll reduce some of the bulk as I start to add the next sections. So I'm going to do the same thing with these 4 sections as I did with the first ones. I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to measure my 1/4 inch, mark it on the seam line, and then I'm going to add it into these corners. When I get to this point, I'm going to just push back the seam here so that I can sew from inside the seam to the other spot and start and stop with a little bit of a back stitching on those. And now it's time for the final Y seams. So I'm going to just take one side at a time. I'm going to line these up. I'm going to make sure I kind of pull the fabric out of the way. And from that 1/4 inch point where all of my seams have come together so far, I'm just going to sew down the side and connect all of those extra sides. Now it's time for the final step, turning our octagon here into a square. What we're going to do is we're going to take our 4-inch squares from our medium, and we are going to cut them across diagonally in half so that we end up with 4 triangles. And we're going to just add these triangles to the light in the corner here. So I'm just going to find my centers, and I can line that center up with the point of the triangle, open that up, and I'm just going to stitch across. And here's the finished North Carolina block. Thank you for joining me today working on the North Carolina block. This was a lot of fun. Even though it had all those Y seams, it was a great opportunity to expand my skills. I did have to do this block a few times before filming just to get it right. So don't feel discouraged if you have to do the same. It's all part of the learning process. I hope you join us again next time. Until then, cheers and happy quilting.